We'd like to welcome our first keynote speaker, Philip Beesley. Philip Beesley is a visual artist, architect, director of Living Architecture System Group, professor in architecture at the University of Waterloo. Philip Beesley professor is a practitioner and researcher developing sculpture and architecture that approach near living functions. He's widely cited as a pioneer in the rapidly expanding field of the interactive systems and responsive architecture. His collaborative research integrates multiple disciplines from art, science, and technology. Beesley directed the Living Architecture System Group, an international consortium sharing research in near living architectural scale systems. Beesley and the LASG were featured within the Venice Biennale of Architecture 2021. He was selected to represent Canada for the 2010 Venice Biennale for the Architecture and the 2012 Biennale of Sydney. Okay, let's welcome Philip Beesley. Professor Philip Beesley.
Thank you so much, Professor G. It is a great honor to be with you and with the great school of Tsinghua University. I will share my screen now. And I hope that you can see.
We can see it.
Yes. I'm going to speak to you today about a new vision for interactive architecture, where I hope that architecture might even become alive. I'm going to be very critical of an old tradition of making shells and clear walls. I'm going to try to argue for the possibility that architecture can be very, very open and connect us in many, many ways, far beyond ourselves. And I hope that that can construct a way of building architecture which can give us some hope as well as heal a deeply, deeply troubling world today. These are the kinds of projects that I have been doing with my collaborators in the Living Architecture Systems Group. The Venice Biennale for Architecture 12 years ago, which was a deeply interactive architecture, and in Seoul a couple of years later, in which layers of material were used, great shells and hovering organizations full of computational systems. And sometimes I work also in very small scales to make wrapping around the body in very happy collaborations, such as with Iris van Herpen, a wonderful Netherlands fashion designer. This results in a sense of many, many small layers wrapping all the way around us and making a vibrating, trembling, very delicate, very gentle kind of interactive architecture. I'm going to be speaking today about a number of projects, including Grove at the Venice Biennale for Architecture this past year, which is a very large collective canopy and gathering place. And it also has a double world, an immersive world, which is projected below it and which houses a myriad of possibilities. I will try to share that as well with you. When I speak to you today, I feel, perhaps like you do, very, very worried and very, very full of hope as well about making a contribution. Architecture is so very important and so valuable, and yet so very difficult today to be confident that we can make a contribution to the fragile world that we live in. When I think about how to make a contribution, I think about the traditions that I have learned and that have been taught to me. For example, I have been taught about space. And when I think about what I have been taught, I think I have been told that space is fundamentally empty, with tiny, tiny stars and clusters of constellations and galaxies. But all of the space in between those small clusters is somehow silent. This is what I am told. And yet, when I look at the evidence of new physics, for example, this beautiful simulation of all known radio transmissions in the entire universe, I think we are told a very, very different picture. Because in this kind of information, we see a remarkable filamentary cluster of many, many strings all drawing together, reaching out, making strands, making an infinite number of cells. And it is almost impossible not to feel that this is very much like a kind of living tissue in which things are connected, that they are not empty at all, but rather that space is full of presence, full of connection, full of structure. In computational systems, similarly, when we look at how multiple systems work together, we do not see emptiness or pure crystals. Instead, we can see when forces are very closely balanced, such as this model of weather, that forces can tip back and forth in very gentle, interwoven kinds of systems. Very, very different from the idea that space is empty and free and that we are alone. I think that we may need some different language to speak about space today. Instead of the traditional idea that space is empty, perhaps we need a much older word for space. Ether, perhaps, the beautiful medieval word that means that space is full of presence and possibility. I think that we need some new models, some new conceptions for how we can work within space and within architecture in order to create very strong and meaningful shared relationships rather than relationships which simply reinforce the walls and the shells and the isolation, which is perhaps symbolized by the sphere that I started this talk with. Instead of this kind of model, it seems to me that we could use a different model of architecture, perhaps rather than the minimum boundary that is represented by this sphere, where we have the most perfect kind of shell wrapping around each of us. I think that we could think of architecture as having a maximum kind of reticulated, expanded reaction face in which as much possible exposure to the surrounding world is offered. This represents a different way of making architecture. It is vulnerable. It is open. It is not strong. Rather, it is very deliberately fragile and sensitive. And perhaps this can result not simply in weakness, but in the most delicious kind of expansion in which each of our bodies is understood to have many, many layers which extend inside as well as outside. Perhaps it would be even true to say that there is fundamentally no difference at all between our consciousness and our bodies and the surrounding space and the world, but rather that there is an exquisitely sensitive continuum between these things, which we simply need to work harder to unlock and realize and fulfill. This asks for a new kind of architecture. It's an architecture which is open and which can result in many connections between people. It's an architecture which can be structured and which can work with weather and light and energy differentials, as well as traditional building materials. It's an architecture which I believe can be taught by nature, by looking very carefully at the processes that nature offers us. For example, when I look at this lovely snowflake in formation, I can see the little crystalline elements being pulled out of the material, creating the maximum possible surface area as a heat sink, creating more and more and more reaction face rather than creating the kind of hardened shell and sphere, the reduction that we might think of as a model of purity and clarity. This perhaps is a great teacher for a kind of interactive architecture. In my own work, I start with that sensibility of trying to create many, many different connections that, rather than being pure and crystalline, are continually opening and interacting and spreading, using aperiodic, not repeating, prime numbers in crystalline series. This is a representative of the Penrose tessellation, which is one kind of tiling system which results in a beautiful, continually shifting kind of surface. And this can be translated into a very simple detailing system. Here is a model that you can see, which can make for a very deeply resilient kind of felt-like, lovely quasi-periodic quilting. And this in turn results in an organization for making architectural canopies and spaces. For example, in the Afru canopy, which you can see, which was built just this last year, the Penrose tessellation that I was just describing here is populated with many, many different elements and then hung with glass and interactive systems and many dozens of microprocessors, organizing this kind of deeply resilient system. In a larger project built 2 years ago, Meander, this same kind of sensibility can be seen at work. Here we can see clouds and veils and rivers and shells all weaving together into a kind of continuum. There are dozens and dozens of microprocessors that run through this system, and it is built upon a fundamental kind of scaffold in which many, many little cells are all woven together into a great hovering mass. There are clouds that hang around the organization, making outer veils. And then inside, there are nests and shells, which are all woven together into a very strong and very resilient kind of canopy. You can see the rivers of cabling and bundles of communication systems and a whole cellular network of many individual vibrating mechanisms and many, many sensors which track our movement and start to make responses. Here you can see some of the center of this work, the great spheres, and I'll show that in just a little bit. When we come up close to this work and gesture and hold out our hands, sensors receive our motion, and then mechanisms respond and send out great rippling, kind of breathing like gentle motions in response. Multiple light emitting diodes reach and send out rippling responses in movement. And the organization of the surfaces are of many, many vessels, each holding prototype cell formulas that are carrying chemistries which respond to the environment. Here you can see many, many individual vibrating parts which wrap around each of the clusters of these chemical interiors which line the shells and spheres. And running all through this kind of environment is a rippling weather-like system, constantly shifting and moving and responding to its environment. Underlying this kind of environment is new custom software which creates and orchestrates some behavior which is based on the idea that there is a weather-like system all surrounding us and many, many influences passing through. And this is based on a custom software which allows a simulation of the sculpture to be maintained continually, while at the same time, there is firmware that controls the actions of individual sensors and actuators based on a very, very granular, fine-grained emergent system in which many, many individual small islands are bundled together, and then those are bundles upon bundles, and then those are bundles upon bundles upon bundles. And this produces a very, very resilient system. Here you can see the simulation being maintained right alongside the physical world. And in this projection, which happens at the same time, a kind of a dream world is projected right alongside the physical architecture as well. I am really enjoying this new way of working in which there can be a sense of possibility continually projected around the physical work in order to reveal many more dimensions than the static physical work that we choose. This organization is based on making very resilient, very, very gentle individual elements, which are very difficult to hold still. In fact, the principle of design is that they are as precarious as possible. That is, that they are deliberately unstable and constantly responsive to their environment. And this results in a very deeply saturated kind of environment, which we can touch and gently move through. Here's an example of a larger environment in which you can see this kind of deeply intermeshed, gentle set of mechanisms rolling and rippling all around us. I'd like to illustrate something of this sensibility in which our own bodies are continuous with the environment. In this set of visualizations, clouds start to move and they ripple around and they wrap around, and material starts to concentrate within the center of this gathering river and storm. And a figure starts to take hold, condensing directly out of the material itself. And we can gradually see that there is a figure there which is completely continuous with its environment. They appear just for an instant like a ghost, and then they dissolve away again into the surroundings. This sense of being deliberately interwoven rather than trying to separate ourselves is one that I think can be a very valuable way of relating to the environment as a model for interactive systems. Because to me, rather than trying to make control that expands our power, we could use interactive systems as a way of realizing that we are not alone and that many, many forces can wrap all the way around us in a delicious kind of interwoven experience. Let me show you a little bit more of recent work in which this idea is extended further. The story of Superbloom, the emancipation story, was mounted this past year as a celebration of Black history in Toronto. And the materials that I have been describing at work in the studio were used in order to clothe a child, creating an expansion of their body first. And they went through a period of suffering when they were very young in a story, and they learned to become strong. And they were challenged by extremely strong spirits all the way around them. And then they started to work and started to find confidence. And gradually, this turned into a great kind of pageant in which the child grew very, very strong and turned into an elder spirit. supported by presences all around them. This is a kind of a creation myth based on the Trinidadian Carnival, which was a celebration of something that is very different than the Western tradition in which we build walls around ourselves. It was a celebration of feeling connected. And here you can see a kind of summary image in which the great clouds reach overhead and we share together in a sense of a great sense of a collective joy that we are connected. As you can tell, some of the work that I'm practicing is really quite optimistic and hopeful. Let me share one more project, which is Grove at the Venice Biennale this past year. Grove gathers the many forces and the interactive systems that I have been describing, and it made a hovering cloud and a canopy overhead, and dozens and dozens of individual speakers, which whispered and created a whole meshwork. And then it created a world below as well in a projection. Here we can see the general space, which is woven into the ancient shipyard, the Arsenale, at the Venice Biennale. And it started with clouds that made shadow plays in which the surrounding spaces were full of murmuring presence. Along the middle layers were custom speakers in which whispers continually played. And then below, there was a pool that we gathered around. And in that pool was projected a story of creation. Gathering all around the edges was a very open kind of public space, a rather optimistic view of architecture without walls in which we could all participate. And the film that we made that was projected in this space used the digital media that I was describing before and wove it together into a kind of creation story. It's a story that acknowledged great suffering as well, in which things, yes, started to bloom and grow, but they also turned into a desert and an experience of death, planetary death, and personal death was acknowledged. The sense that we are deeply, deeply uncertain in what is happening today, and that we can wrap our work together into a great chorus which moves through huge suffering, almost unspeakable suffering, as well as passages of joy. In cycles, moving through this work, the work wove together with many, many crystalline, expanded architectural components and made a garden in the center. And within that garden, new life started to bloom, a kind of a nest for architecture. And then towards the end of the film, we receded and we started moving back into space. And instead of moving back into the empty space that I was speaking about earlier in this talk, I hope that we were left with a sense that space really can be full of possibility and sensitivity. And so I'd like to sum up now. I have spoken about how difficult the world seems today, and how important it is to find an architecture that can create possibility, that offers interaction and exchange and involvement. I have been very critical about a kind of tradition, a Western tradition, in which we think that we should make cells around us and walls and closures. And instead, I've tried to argue for a model of design in which the maximum possible reaction face might be woven around us, bringing in the weather, opening thresholds, seeing that those kinds of forces can be very resilient and very, very durable, and that they refresh us and renew us. I've tried to argue for a different word for space itself. Rather than seeing space as empty, I've tried to argue for a kind of space which is full of possibility. I've tried to suggest that perhaps some new names for space itself would help us to move into some new models of architecture. And this can result in a very deliberate new discipline in which we work systematically with multiple open layers, each one of which is as sensitive and open and precarious as possible. This can result, I believe, in a sense that we share and that we can listen to each other, and that life is very, very possible in that sharing. This can result perhaps in a sense that instead of us being isolated individuals, that we are profoundly connected. And this offers, I hope, a very optimistic view that might be a contribution to a new kind of interactive architecture. So I hope that's a contribution. Thank you.